Spring 1914, a cotton mill town in South Carolina. A doctor in a dark suit walks the length of a boarding house row, stops at the open doors, and looks at the hands of the people inside. He is not listening to their chests. He is not taking their pulse. He is looking at their skin, at the backs of the hands and the wrists, where the sun has left a stain that is not a tan. The skin there is red, then brown, then cracked, splitting along the lines like old leather. He has seen it in orphanages. He has seen it in asylums. He is beginning to see where it is and where it is not. The doctor is Joseph Goldberger, an officer of the United States Public Health Service. He has been sent to the American South to find the cause of a disease that is killing people by the thousand every year, and that almost no one outside the South has heard of. The disease is pellagra. It starts with the skin. A rash comes up on the parts of the body the sun touches, the hands, the neck, the face, and it comes up on both sides of the body at once, matched, like a pair. Then the bowels fail. Then, in the worst cases, the mind goes. The old textbooks named it in 4 words, and the words rhymed in Latin so students could remember them: dermatitis, diarrhea, dementia, death. By the time Goldberger arrives, pellagra is filling wards in state asylums across the region. Doctors are calling it an epidemic, and they are nearly all agreed on what it is. They believe it is catching. Understand first how large the thing was, because the numbers are easy to say and hard to feel. This was not a scattering of odd cases in a few counties. Across the American South, pellagra was a mass epidemic, running through the poorest states year after year for a generation. In a single bad year, the recorded cases ran into the hundreds of thousands, and the deaths into the thousands. Over the first decades of the 20th century, the disease is thought to have struck some 3 million Americans and killed on the order of 100,000 of them. It crowded the asylums so heavily that in some southern states, pellagra alone accounted for a large share of the patients admitted and a large share of the ones carried out. It came back every spring when the winter stores of cheap food had worn thinnest, and it went by names that sounded almost gentle for what it did. Spring sickness, the mal de la rosa, the sickness of the rose, for the red bloom it raised on the skin. The country as a whole barely knew it existed, because it lived where the country was not looking, among sharecroppers and mill hands and the inmates of institutions, the people whose deaths did not make the national papers. That is the medical consensus in 1914. Pellagra spreads through institutions the way a fever spreads, and where a thing spreads, most doctors reason, a germ must be moving from the sick to the well. Some blame an insect, a biting fly that breeds in the corn. Some blame a poison in spoiled corn itself. But the leading idea, the one taught in the schools and printed in the journals, is that pellagra is an infectious disease passed somehow from person to person, and that the answer will be found the way the answers to typhoid and cholera were found, under a microscope, in the hunt for an organism. Goldberger is a man who hunts organisms. That is his training and his record. Before the South, he chased yellow fever, typhus, dengue, diseases carried by mosquitoes and lice, and he caught 2 of them himself in the chasing and nearly died. He is not a skeptic of germs. He is one of the government's best men at finding them. So when the Surgeon General hands him pellagra and tells him to solve it, everyone expects him to do what he has always done: find the bug. He was an immigrant, which mattered to how some of them saw him. He had been born in a village in what is now Slovakia, brought to New York as a boy, raised on the Lower East Side, trained as a physician in the city. He was a northerner and a Jew, arriving in the rural South to tell it something it did not want to hear about its own poor. None of that made his evidence weaker. All of it made his evidence easier to ignore. Instead, in his first months in the South, he does something plainer. He looks at who is sick, and the pattern he finds does not fit a germ at all. He goes to the orphanages first. In 2 orphan homes in Mississippi, where he settles in and studies the children closely, pellagra is everywhere, but not evenly. It strikes the children in the middle years hardest, the ones roughly 6 to 12. The youngest, the babies and toddlers still getting milk, are mostly spared. The oldest, the ones nearly grown, are mostly spared. If a germ were loose in the building, moving child to child in the shared beds and shared cups and shared privies, it should not politely skip the infants and the teenagers and settle on the ages in between. A germ does not read a calendar, but a dinner table does divide a house by age, because the little ones were given milk that the middle children were not, and the biggest ones were sometimes set to work and fed a little better for it. The disease was tracking not who touched whom, but who ate what. Then he goes to the asylums and he finds the pattern that will decide everything. In a large state asylum in Georgia, and in others like it, pellagra tears through the inmates. The patients get it, ward after ward, year after year. But the nurses, the attendants, the doctors, the staff who work in those same wards every day, who breathe the same air, handle the same patients, sleep sometimes in the same buildings, they do not get it, almost never. Here are 2 groups of people in one place sharing everything a germ would need to travel, and one group is falling sick and dying while the other walks among them untouched for years on end. In the ordinary run of a contagious disease, the people who nurse the sick are the ones who fall next. Here they were the ones who stayed well. Goldberger asks the question the germ theory cannot answer. What is different between the inmate and the attendant? There was one more group that told him the same thing without meaning to. In the asylums, when a pellagra patient recovered enough to be sent home and then came back later, the disease often came back with them, in step with the return to a poor home table, and there was a fact that the germ theory could never square. In institution after institution, the disease clustered in the wards where the food was worst and thinned out wherever the food improved, tracking the kitchen and not the crowding. The sickest rooms were not the most packed. They were the most poorly fed. It is not the air. It is not the walls. It is the plate. The inmates eat what the institution feeds the poor and the confined. The staff eat better and often eat apart, buying meat and milk on wages the inmates did not have. In the orphanages, the same thing. The children who got sick were fed one way. The ones who were spared, the little ones on milk, and the older ones, sometimes given more, were fed another. Everywhere Goldberger looks, the disease does not follow contact. It follows the diet. And the diet of the pellagra ward is the diet of the poor South, the same in the mill town and the orphanage and the asylum. Cornmeal, molasses, fatback, the fatty salt pork that is cheap and keeps, bread made from corn, syrup for sweetness, grease for the pan, little meat that is not fat, little milk, few fresh vegetables, almost no lean protein at all. They called it the 3M diet, for meal, meat, and molasses, though the meat was mostly fat. It filled a belly for pennies. It left something out that a body could not do without. Goldberger draws a conclusion that will cost him 10 years of his life to prove. Pellagra is not something you catch. It is something you lack. The cause is not in the body of the sick. It is missing from the plate of the poor. He knew what that claim would mean before he made it out loud. If pellagra came from a germ, Then the South had a medical problem, and medicine could hunt the germ, name it, and one day kill it with a vaccine or a drug. No one had to change. But if pellagra came from the diet of the poor, then the South did not have a medical problem. It had a poverty problem. The cornmeal and molasses and fatback were not a choice. They were what a sharecropper's wage and a mill hand's wage could buy. A tenant family that owed its landlord a share of the cotton and bought its food on credit at the landlord's store ate what the ledger allowed, and the ledger allowed corn. To say the cause was diet was to say the cause was low pay and cotton and a whole economy that kept its workers fed on the cheapest food there was. A germ could be blamed on nature. A diet had to be blamed on someone, and the someone was not the sick. So Goldberger did the thing a scientist does. He stopped asserting and started testing. And his first test was the kind that changes a life, because it worked. He went to institutions where pellagra was constant, the Mississippi orphanages and a Georgia asylum, and he did not give the inmates medicine. He gave them food. He added to their meals the things the poor diet left out: fresh milk, eggs, meat that was lean, not just fat, beans and peas. He kept the corn, but he broke the monopoly the corn had held over every plate. Then he waited and watched. The pellagra faded. In the orphanages where he changed the food, the children who had the rash healed, and, more telling, new cases stopped appearing. Where the old diet had produced dozens of cases a year, the new diet produced almost none. He was not treating a symptom, he was closing the tap. Feed people the missing food, and the disease that everyone called an epidemic simply did not come. He had shown, in real institutions full of real patients, that better food prevented pellagra and cured the early cases. For a man who believed the cause was diet, it was as close to proof as an orphanage could give. It was not enough. He knew it would not be enough, because he had only shown that adding food stopped the disease. He had not shown the reverse, that taking food away could start it. The critics could still say the food was doing something incidental, that the real cause was a germ the good meals happened to fight off. To close the argument, he needed to do the opposite of curing. He needed to cause pellagra, on purpose, in people who did not have it, using nothing but a bad diet. You cannot do that to the sick. You cannot do it to children. Goldberger found volunteers who could consent, and the place he found them was a prison. At the Rankin Prison Farm in Mississippi in 1915, the governor of the state offered a pardon to convicts who would take part in an experiment. 11 healthy men volunteered, white men in reasonable condition, serving their time on the farm, weighing the risk of a strange sickness against the promise of walking free. For the length of the study they were fed, on purpose, the diet of the poor pellagra ward: cornbread, grits, rice, syrup, sweet potatoes, fatback, plenty of it, enough calories, no one went hungry, but built almost entirely from the cheap starches and fats, with the milk and meat and vegetables held back. The rest of the prison ate normally around them, the same buildings, the same guards, the same air. The only difference, the food on the plate. For months, nothing. Then the skin began to change. On the hands of the volunteers, on the parts the diet had doomed, the same rash rose that Goldberger had been reading off the hands of strangers since the spring of 1914. Symmetrical, both sides at once. Men who had walked into the study healthy now carried the early marks of pellagra, produced by nothing but their plates, in a prison where no one else was falling ill. The diet alone had done it. He had made the disease, and then, the moment the study ended and the men went back to ordinary food, it began to lift. Cause it with the plate, cure it with the plate. The pardoned men were released. Some of them, it was said, would rather have served out their sentences than repeat what those months had done to them. And still, the establishment would not turn. This is the part of the story that has nothing to do with science. Goldberger had shown that adding food cured pellagra and that removing food caused it. By the ordinary rules of medicine, that should have ended the debate. It did not. Some of his critics kept insisting the real cause was a microbe, that his diet work was a distraction, that a proper germ was still out there waiting to be found. A prominent commission that had studied the disease before him had leaned toward contagion, and men do not abandon a printed conclusion easily. Their resistance was partly honest habit, the pull of a theory a whole profession had been trained inside. But it was also something harder. A germ was an enemy any Southerner could agree to fight. A diet of poverty was an accusation, and it pointed at the wages and the crops and the men who set them. Southern politicians and boosters bristled at a federal officer telling the region its poor were sick because they were poor. It was easier, and it was cheaper, to keep looking for a bug. So Goldberger did the last thing he had left. He put his own body between the theory and the truth. The critics said pellagra was contagious. Fine, he decided. He would prove it was not, by trying as hard as any human being could to catch it, and failing. What he did next was described, by those who knew of it, in the plainest possible terms, and it is not easy to read even now. He took the sick patient's own skin, the scales that flaked from the pellagra rash, and their blood, and the discharges of the disease, the material from their noses and their bowels and their bladders. He rolled the scabs and the waste into capsules and pills with flour, and he swallowed them. He injected the sick patient's blood into his own arm. He smeared the secretions into his own nose and throat. He did it more than once, on more than a dozen occasions across the studies, taking into his own body the very things a germ, if there were a germ, would have used to kill him. He was not the only one. His wife, Mary, asked to join, and he let her. She took an injection of a pellagra patient's blood into her body, a woman volunteering to be exposed to a disease the whole country believed was catching, to help her husband prove that it was not. His assistants and colleagues joined too, 16 people in all across the sittings. They made a grim ritual of it, this handful of educated people swallowing and injecting and smearing on the matter of the dying. And among themselves they gave the sittings a bitter name. They called them filth parties. None of them got pellagra, not Goldberger, not Murray, not one of the volunteers who ate the scabs and took the blood of the sick. They exposed themselves, on purpose, to everything a contagious disease could offer, and they stayed well, because there was no contagion to catch. You cannot swallow a deficiency. You cannot inject a thing that is missing. The filth parties proved a negative in the only way a negative can be proved, by a person standing where the danger was said to be and coming to no harm. He had now shown it from every side. Add the food and the disease heals. Remove the food and the disease appears. Take the sick person's own blood and filth into your body, and nothing happens at all. A germ fit none of it. A missing nutrient fit all of it. And the country, for the most part, still did not act. Understanding stayed inside the small circle that read his reports. In the wider South, the diet did not change, because the thing that set the diet was not ignorance, it was money. Goldberger himself came to see this clearly. In the years after his human experiments, he tried to trace pellagra not through wards, but through economics, working alongside a public health statistician named Edgar Sidenstricker to follow the price of cotton and the wages of the mill towns, showing that when times were hard and food was dearest, pellagra rose, and when a family could afford more than cornmeal, it fell. He had started as a man hunting a germ. He ended as a man documenting poverty, because that was where the disease actually lived. He went further than wards and prisons. To answer the doubters with numbers, he and Sidenstricker settled into a set of 7 cotton mill villages in South Carolina and studied them household by household, season by season. They recorded what each family earned and what each family ate and who among them fell ill. The result was a line so straight it was hard to argue with. The families with the least money ate the narrowest diet, and the families with the narrowest diet had the most pellagra. Where a village store was owned by the mill and stocked mostly with cheap staples, the disease was worse than where families could reach an open market and buy fresh food, raise the income, widen the plate, and the disease receded. It was not the crowding of the villages that predicted who got sick. It was the household budget. He had turned a disease into a graph of wages, and the graph pointed at the same thing his wards had. Then the river made his case for him, in the worst possible way. In the spring of 1927, the Mississippi broke its banks in the greatest flood the country had seen, drowning the delta, driving hundreds of thousands of poor farming families out of their homes and into relief camps strung along the levees. Goldberger understood at once what would follow. When people are torn off their land and fed from emergency rations of cornmeal and little else, pellagra follows the way a shadow follows a body. He and Sidenstricker went to study the flooded country, and the predicted spike came. So he pushed a simple, cheap answer into the relief effort. Brewer's yeast, the humble byproduct of making beer, was rich in the very thing the corn diet lacked, and it cost almost nothing. He urged the Red Cross to hand it out to the refugees, and where it was given, it prevented and treated the disease for pennies a person. He could not yet name the substance in the yeast that did the work. He only knew that the yeast carried it, and that it saved people who would otherwise have broken out in the rose-red rash of the camps. He kept working the problem to the end of his life. He searched for the exact thing in the good foods that the poor diet lacked, the specific substance that milk and meat and greens and yeast carried, and cornmeal did not. He got close. He proved it was something present in small amounts in particular foods, something that survived cooking, something that brewer's yeast held in abundance. But he never held the answer in his hand. He never got to name the missing thing. Joseph Goldberger died in January of 1929, of cancer, still an officer of the Public Health Service, still, in the eyes of many of his peers, a man with an interesting theory that had not been fully accepted. He was 54 years old. He had spent 15 years telling the country a truth about pellagra, and he died before the country would fully admit he was right. The name he could not reach came 8 years after his grave was dug. In 1937, in a laboratory at the University of Wisconsin, a biochemist named Conrad Elvegem was studying a disease in dogs called black tongue, the animal twin of pellagra, the dog's mouth breaking down the way a person's skin and gut did. Elvegem found that he could cure black tongue with a specific compound he isolated from liver, a small molecule called nicotinic acid. It was a vitamin, one of the B group, and it would come to be known by a friendlier name, niacin, chosen partly so that food on a grocery shelf would not seem to advertise a link to nicotine. Within months, doctors treating human patients confirmed what the dogs had shown. Give a pellagra sufferer nicotinic acid, and the rash healed, the gut settled, and even minds that had begun to slip could come back. The missing thing finally had a name. It was in the milk Goldberger had added to the orphans' plates. It was in the lean meat, and the eggs, and the beans, and the brewer's yeast of the flood camps. It was thin in cornmeal, and worse, there was a cruelty hidden in the corn itself. The niacin in corn is largely bound up in a form the human gut cannot unlock, and corn is also poor in tryptophan, the building block from which the body can make its own niacin when nothing else supplies it. Peoples who had eaten corn for thousands of years in Mexico and Central America had, without knowing the chemistry, learned to soak and cook their corn in lime and ash, a treatment that freed the vitamin and let the body reach it. The American South took the corn, but not the ancient method. It ground the grain and fried the bread and left the niacin locked away. The poor diet had starved people of one small molecule, and that starvation had cracked their skin and loosened their bowels, and in the end, taken their minds. Goldberger had been looking, all along, for a vitamin that had not yet been discovered. Once it had a name, the ending came fast. Niacin could be made cheaply in a factory and added straight to food. In the years that followed, and especially during the Second World War, bread and flour in the United States began to be enriched, dosed on purpose, with the vitamins that milling stripped away, niacin among them, alongside thiamine, riboflavin, and iron. By the early 1940s, enriched flour was written into wartime food rules, and the missing molecule was being baked back into the daily bread of the whole country, whether anyone thought about it or not. Pellagra, the disease that had filled southern asylums and killed on the order of 100,000 Americans within living memory, began to vanish. Within a decade it was rare. It did not vanish because someone found the germ. There was never a germ. It vanished because the missing thing was finally put back into the food. Count the years he was right and unheard. He made his case from diet in 1914. He cured children with food and caused the disease in prison volunteers with a bad diet within a year or two. He ate the scabs and took the blood and did not fall ill. He drew the graph of wages, and he sent yeast into the flood camps and watched it work. And for more than a decade, while he was doing all of it, the disease kept killing people whose only sickness was that they were too poor to eat anything but corn. He was not wrong for those years. He was early. There is a difference, and the people who died in the wards paid for the difference. There is a temptation, telling this, to make Goldberger only a hero and the doctors who fought him only fools. It is not that simple, and he would have been the first to say so. The germ theory was the great triumph of his own era of medicine, and it had earned its authority by conquering real killers. A generation trained to find organisms found it genuinely hard to believe that a disease that spread through institutions was not, in some way, spreading. What Goldberger saw that they did not was not a better microscope. It was a plate of cornbread and fatback, and the fact that the people forced to eat it got sick, and the people who ate something more did not. He looked at poverty and read it as a cause. That was the leap. The people in this story deserve to be named for what they were. The inmates and the orphans and the mill families were not careless or unclean. They were fed the cheapest food a hard economy offered, and it was missing one thing, and that absence marked their skin and cost some of them their lives. The prisoners who volunteered at Rankin ate a ruinous diet for the promise of freedom and helped prove a truth that saved strangers they would never meet. The families in the flood camps took a spoonful of yeast and did not know they were being handed the edge of a discovery. Mary Goldberger took a sick man's blood into her arm to stand beside her husband's evidence, and Goldberger himself swallowed the filth of the dying, over and over, to prove that the poor were not carrying a plague, only carrying a lack. He never got the name of the vitamin. He never saw the enriched bread. He was mocked for saying a spreading disease was not contagious, and he was right when he said it. And he stayed right every year they doubted him, and he died still doubted. The disease everyone swore was catching was killing thousands a year in the American South. Dr. Joseph Goldberger looked at who lived and who died, and he understood it before anyone would let him. The cure was food,